Good evening, everyone. I'm Burçak Keskin-Kozat, Associate Director of the Mediterranean Studies Forum and the Sohaib and Sara Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion session about the recent developments in Egypt and Turkey. If you have followed the news from the Middle East this summer, the region is rocked by an intensifying civil war, violence, police brutality, widespread protests, and a military intervention. To better understand the historical, political, and economic dynamics behind these events, we invited 4 Stanford affiliates to share their thoughts and research with us in relation to Turkey and Egypt. Each panelist will speak about 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor for general discussion. Before we start, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, namely the CDDRL Program on Arab Reform and Democracy and the Stanford Humanities Center Workshop on Ethnic Minorities, Religious Communities, Rights and Democracy in the Modern Middle East and Central Asia. Our first speaker is Amr Adly, who is a postdoctoral fellow in CDDRL Program on Arab Reform and Democracy at Stanford. He received his PhD in Social and Political Sciences from the European University. His research focuses on state reform and development in the context of the Middle East. And at Stanford, he is working on a project about entrepreneurial reforms in Egypt and Tunisia after the Arab Spring. The title of his presentation tonight is Egypt After June 30th, Between Abortive and Potential Fascism.
Thank you. So, like the term fascism, which is like it seems very much to belong to the interwar period. Really, it's like it comes really from the past. Has been employed a lot in Egypt in the last couple of months. So those who stand against the coup are talking about what they call like military fascism, in reference mainly to the like massive atrocities that were committed in order to suppress the Brotherhood and their allies. And on the other side, you have actually those who supported the military intervention and the mass demonstrations that took place in late June, actually calling that the Brotherhood trial to establish a political system as some kind of a religious fascism. So fascism has actually become part of the not that jargon anymore. It has become part of the daily discussions in Egypt. You find it in newspapers, etc. Even though like the term was not like people were not familiar with the term only a couple of years ago, when like everybody's like some people in the academia started to talk about it. So what I'm trying to do, of course, is to use fascism in a more academic way. So it's not the way it is like used in the newspaper. So don't worry, like I'll try to say something meaningful. And the main idea here is actually trying to get out of this problem of what happened on June 30th, because we definitely have a coup, but then it's a bit more than a coup, because other than that, things wouldn't have developed the way they have, or they are still. And it's not a popular revolt either, even though there are many traits of it as like a popular revolt. So actually, like a friend of mine and the mentor was like saying that this is neither a military coup nor a popular revolution. This is like a military revolution. So it's like a mix, yeah. And actually, she was referring to one of the classics on Nasserism in Egypt that was written by the late Anwar Abdel Malik in the late 1960s, in which he actually called like the title of the book was Egypt, a Military Society. So he was going deep into the social and the economic roots of the military authoritarian regime that was established in 1952. So what I'm trying here to do is actually to look into what seem to be like the fascist traits that you have in, or that we had in the Brotherhood's attempt to establish a political order, especially during the very short like period under Mohammed Morsi, and then which I actually consider as some kind of an abortive fascism, and it has like I try, of course, to converse with like one of the main scholars that wrote about fascism as a historic phenomenon, was like the late Juan Linz. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of weeks ago. And yet, like, there are other traits of actually of fascism in the order that is being formed now. And this actually gets us to one of the facts that many people in like in the Western media mainly do not catch, is that ever since like the ouster of Mubarak, most of the political alternatives that were on the table were quite authoritarian in one sense or another. And that is one major problem of having like a massive protest movement that could undo like relatively like a well-established regime led by a dictator like Mubarak. But then actually this protest movement was not necessarily a pro-democratic one, and definitely the elites which actually inherited this political space that was cleared after Mubarak's ouster and the well, temporary crippling of his security apparatus that used to dominate the public sphere. Like these elites had no, like did not really contribute to the building even of a pro-democracy movement. And one of the main things that we have here, which is actually like a live evidence, if we can say so, is the 2012 constitution, the one that was passed in December and that actually started this, what I may call actually like some sort of civil strife that started in the late 2012 and led actually like built up to June 30th and to what is happening now. Like the 2012 constitution, which is like Egypt's first post-revolutionary constitution, is actually like a compromise in most of its articles, a compromise between the military, the security apparatus, the brotherhood, of course, the religious right, the state-controlled or like, I don't know, state-owned like religious institution. And that is pretty much it, as a matter of fact. The whole problem here is that the brotherhood who actually contemplated their role following Mubarak's ouster as the brokers of such a deal between like the old state apparatus that everybody knew was crippled in a sense, was disabled, but not permanently dismantled or set aside. The whole idea was actually trying to reach some compromise with these people. And this is one of the main reasons why the military, after toppling Morsi, did not really think of abrogating the constitution and starting like a new constitution, like drafting a new constitution from scratch, even though actually they are the ones that accuse the brotherhood of writing down a constitution of a dysfunctional regime, of an authoritarian regime. But actually they did not, because they have all of the privileges that they wanted written in this constitution. And that's actually nowadays one of the debates that is not very public actually, because of the popular support that the military has, and because of course that the media is serving the military's image against the brotherhood. But that's one of the things that like most of the people that were following up what was happening with the 2012 constitution were very aware of, that the military has written itself, as a matter of fact, for those who know the details, the military wrote down like 10 to 12 articles and clauses of the constitution that would just like establish its, well, independent state, as a matter of fact, from that of Egypt. And they have all of these privileges. And now, of course, like they have this like attempt to actually design a political system that they can dominate. So back to this idea of abortive and potential fascism. So Juan Linz has many writings, of course, on fascism as one sort of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And like he used to set this distinction very clear, that fascism is a very particular phenomenon that happened in the interwar period, and not every authoritarian regime, as violent as it may be, can be called fascist. And he had these characteristics that he held, of course, like referring back to the classical fascist cases of like Italy and Germany, mainly in the interwar period and during World War II. So we can't really now talk about like a fascist regime by any means, with like the very exception, I don't know, of like North Korea, for example, which is like a case from the museum, really. It's like just like has been there since the 1950s. But then, like for others, what Juan Lynch was saying is that this very type had to do with the context and that it has become extinct. And he was actually saying that, but it's not totally absent from nowadays, because actually you have it there. But the metaphor that he used, which I find very meaningful, is that you have authoritarian regimes with fascist traits and others that don't have these fascist traits. So the whole idea is about like whether an authoritarian order has these characteristics or not. And he was actually, the metaphor that he used was that you have like the crowns of, like Roman crowns of columns that you may find in churches and mosques, but they're no more like Roman temples. You just have them there. So it's very much the case. And if we look at the fascism as like the historic phenomenon itself, it's like an anti-democratic mainly movement. It's like what we may call like a revolution against the revolution. It's this idea of actually using the same tools that were like used in order to enfranchise people, to get more people in. Of course, like with the rise of like social democracy in Europe at that time, and then actually it's a revolution against it. It's like using the same tools to undo it, and then to establish like not just an authoritarian regime that would well, actually, like bar everybody from the public sphere, but even like a regime with like a totalitarian content of its like ideology. So this thing of actually like having like a movement against a democratic or a pro-democracy movement, I hold it to be like very much there in the attempt that the Brotherhood tried to, or actually the attempted political regime that the Brotherhood tried to establish. And the main thing here is that you had definitely a strong ideological content there. The thing is that the Brotherhood is not a post-Islamist movement by any means, not a post-Islamist party by any means. It's pragmatic in a sense, but it's more of like opportunistic, really. It's the sense of accepting this very procedural kind of democracy that would just lead to majoritarian rule. And that is very much the problem here, that you move into like holding elections. And of course, we all know that democracy is not about elections. So that's what actually some would call like a ballotocracy, not a democracy. And you ended up very much there, that this is the version of democracy that we have, one that produces a very clear majority. And the way actually it was used, especially after the crisis of November, December 2012, through which the Constitution was passed, like in the context of very deep social divisions, the idea that was used here, that those who were protesting against like Morsi's constitutional declaration and then the attempt to pass the Constitution, were actually people that did not belong to the majority, and the majority was mainly made up of like Muslim Egyptians. So you have many of the Brotherhood, like the key Brotherhood figures that are actually saying that most of the protesters that you have in the streets are Copts or are seculars. So it's like taken that whoever is Muslim is like for the majority, which is the Brotherhood. Whoever is not is like a non-Muslim or whatever. And you had actually like direct incitement against like a religious minority, something that is happening now, and the context actually has been set, like the scene has been set for it. So, and one of the other things, for example, that is very clear is using the word for shar'iyya, which is legitimacy in Arabic, which is very close, by the way, to sharia, which is sharia, using them interchangeably. And as a matter of fact, they are used to mean the same thing for the basis. And you end up actually with a movement that has most of the references in their head is like mainly like the classical Islamist ideology that was developed in the 1930s and 40s, that had a very totalitarian conception of how society and state should be related. You have them there, like they are used interchangeably, and you just have this group that has this, that subscribes to this ideology, but then they have no problem with democracy as a procedure that would always lead to the production of this majoritarian rule. It's this very like interesting thing. But then if you look into like the substance of such a democracy, you can easily take a look at the constitution and see that nothing really has changed compared to the 1971 constitution, the one under which Mubarak and Sadat ruled, where you have like very little guarantees of basic rights and liberties. And of course, this was not just what the Brotherhood was calling for. Of course, like the military was very happy with that as well. They have no commitment to such a thing. But then it's this thing actually that you have this very twisted link between like procedural democracy that would lead to some kind of religious rule, even though like how we may say it, like it did not it was not always that clear, but it was there, and like of course like it's actually like based on a paper which is very long, so I'll spare you the details. So that's one of the things. But the other thing actually that the Brotherhood and the Islamists in general played a significant role at, like during the transitional period when the military was directly ruling, was actually the idea of making sure that the revolution cannot get radicalized more. And this has to do actually with the July 2011 first mass rally that the Islamists held, like 1 million man march. And for the first time, like they were using the same slogans for the revolution, like the people want. So they were like saying the people want the application of Sharia, or the people want an Islamist state. And on that very day, actually, they ended up with a very strange thing, that you had the masses saying, Ya Mushir anta al-Amir. Mushir is like he was like the head of the military at that time, the one that Morsi later on got rid of. And he's like, you are the leader. And that was actually a gesture towards the military, that the Islamists are willing to share power with the military. And that was actually the case, by the way. They were willing and they did their part on, like they delivered. The only problem is that the military did not deliver. And they found them like, and that's the whole thing actually, which leads me to this abortive fascism. When Juan Linz actually has this study about like the different fascist regimes that were established in the in the interwar period, and he's saying that actually we only know of the ones that could be established and consolidated, but then we have other cases where fascism was not established, and this mainly has to do with like, the Achilles heel with fascism, is that you need to use state oppression in order to consolidate the regime. The Brotherhood, by the way, were very, like I can assume, they were okay with this idea that establishing a regime which they dominate is going to call for some kind of civil strife, and they were living with that. This happened since December, actually, and it culminated in June 30th, and most of the intelligence that we're having now is that they were saying that the key issue is the military. Like the most important thing is the military not to move. But other than that, we can handle it. And this is Achilles heel, really, that unless you own the military and the police, you can't establish such a thing. And this was the only thing that, like, the whole trial got aborted. The military, which was part and parcel of the 2012 constitution and this idea of establishing like an authoritarian post-Mubarak order, for many reasons that there's no time to really enumerate here, just moved against the Brotherhood. The only problem is that we are still facing this problem of establishing an authoritarian, yet another authoritarian order that would succeed Mubarak, with many fascist traits as well. You have this like very xenophobic, ultra-nationalist overtones, as a matter of fact, that are there, that are used by the state media, by the private media, that is allied with the military very much. And you have this thing again. And the more the problem intensifies, because there's no political process now. You just have like people that demonstrate and others that try to oppress them. It's as simple as that. The more actually like this trend may deepen, and you may end up actually with some kind of a state-sponsored popular movement against the Islamists in a country like Egypt. This could happen. It happened, by the way, in July, because the military is supported by many strata and many constituencies in the Egyptian society. And the way things are portrayed now, and maybe the way things are, is that it's all about actually bringing the state down, because this is the only way. And this makes many people like quite fearful of the future, and thus more tolerant of whichever exceptional measures can be taken in order to make sure that the state is there. So you already have this actually like very classical proto-fascist like idolization of the state. As a matter of fact, it's there with very high xenophobia, and people are believing in conspiracies that simply don't make any sense. But they are there, and people believe in them, and that doesn't really like debilitate this belief. So you have like now well, speaking of the Turks, so it's like the Turks allied with the Brotherhood, financed by the Qataris, and of course you have the Israelis there doing something. Of course, the Americans are there as well, with the Iranians and Hezbollah, all are conspiring against Egypt. By the way, it's written that way, and it works. Thank you.
Thank you, Amr. Next, we will hear from Alexander Key, who's Assistant Professor of Arabic and Comparative Literature at Stanford. Alexander lived and worked in the Middle East for human rights and development organizations on and off from 1999 to 2005. He subsequently received his PhD in Islamic and Arabic Studies from Harvard University in 2012. He is now completing a book on the Arabic philosophy of language during the 11th century. He is also tweeting about current affairs through the Twitter handle at Alexander M. Key. The title of his presentation tonight is "Should It Matter What We Call It? Islamic, Democratic, and Spring Politics."
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Good evening. Thank you, Birchak, for organizing this. And thank you, Amr, for giving me a hard act to follow, I think. And now I'd like to talk about the three words in my title, Islamic, Democratic, and Spring. Although for democratic, I won't really be asking what a democracy is, a reasonably well-established or tired debate, as connecting the Occupy movement to democracy. And these are really just some remarks that I'm going to try and keep to 10 minutes on my own experiences thinking and writing about these issues. And in talking about word meanings, of course, I'm a comparative literature professor. Thinking about what people do with words is really what I do, which is one of the reasons why I was so happy to listen to Amr's talk, because what he was doing was giving us a history of the new set of meanings that have been given to the word fascism in a particular political context of Egypt of the last couple of years, which is, I think, exactly the way questions like this should be addressed. And Amr's, of course, a political and social scientist. So if he's talking about word meanings, they must be worth thinking about. If we take what has happened, the protests in Turkey about the park and what's still going on in Turkey, and we look at the way that the analytical classes, the commentariat in the West have dealt with these events, we can see that there have been two primary prisms or lenses used to deal and to explain what's happening in Turkey. Those people who've fitted the events in Turkey into the Occupy narrative have done so quite successfully, and it's an easy case to make that the Occupy Wall Street protests, the subsequent protests in capitals around the world, the Spanish indignation movement, you can fit what's happening in Turkey into that narrative quite easily. What I would like to point out about doing that is that it inevitably brings the Turkish context closer to us. And by us, I mean the commentariat writing in English, or I mean Stanford on the West Coast in 2013. So if you call what's happened in Istanbul Occupy, you are talking about, you're making the regime that the Occupy protests were happening against in Istanbul analogous to the regimes that the Occupy protests were happening against in America and the UK. And if you think of some of the main dynamics, these are democratically elected governments, and what's being protested is overreach by those democratically elected leaders. What's being protested is police brutality and attacks on the freedom of expression and the freedom of political action. And I think that analogy works quite well if you look at those two things. It also has the advantage of highlighting the relevance of protesting against the inequities of capitalism, or certain types of neoliberal capitalism, which can be done just as well in Istanbul as they can in Palo Alto. The alternative lens that's got used for Istanbul is the Arab Spring. And I think what happens when the commentariat talk about the Arab Spring is it pushes what's happening in Istanbul closer to them. Them being an Arab, dark-skinned, chaotic, religious other. And it makes it much less conceivable that it could be in any way analogous to the situation that we find ourselves in here in this room. There are not likely, this not being the 1960s, to be tanks on Stanford campus. And people dying in front of genuine large-scale violent military interventions is what's been happening in the Arab Spring in Egypt and across the Arab world. If you take some of the main dynamics of the Arab Spring, you're looking at what Roger Owen has called the Arab president for life as a type. The Arab president for life who is extractive of the natural resources in his own, it's always his own country, liberal use of torture and the secret police, and steady movement towards a hereditary transfer of power, which didn't manage to quite happen in Egypt, despite the Mubarak regime working hard in that direction, and happened successfully in Syria, for example. So what I'm talking about here is these are potentially damaging confusions that get made from our perspective about whether we should be calling what's happening in Istanbul Occupy or Arab Spring. If we call Turkey an Arab Spring, we put Turkey in the category of places in which revolutions are needed in order for them to be like us. Just like America in 1783, France in 1789, if you're talking about Turkey in terms of an Arab Spring, you're talking about they need to have that sort of cathartic experience to get to where we are. Whereas if you call Turkey Occupy, it draws us, the people making that comparison, into difficult and uncomfortable parallels that we make between the way their democracy, between the way Turkish democracy functions, with all its problems, with the fact that Erdogan has stayed in power, with the fact that he seems to be thinking about the Arab president for life model sometimes, depending how cynical and worried you are. And the fact that you're using the Occupy lens then makes you think about the things we're maybe not so comfortable about on our side. You know, the fact that the United Kingdom political elite all goes to the same school, without exception. The fact that America has persistent political dynasties with the same surname over decades. And that's the advantage of using the Occupy lens, is that it forces us to think about these things. And, you know, the inevitable inequities produced by certain types of capitalism. So I wrote a blog post on these kind of comparative issues. And what I was saying, and what I concluded there was that when the wrong discourses get established, people get hurt. And I would and I made it quite clear that what we should be doing is separating them in the way that I've just laid out. And then the journal that I co-founded and edit, New Middle Eastern Studies, received a submission from a political science PhD student in Tehran, in which he made a very, very clear case for putting Occupy Wall Street and the protests in Istanbul and the Spanish indignation movement and the Arab Spring and the protests in Brazil all in exactly the same bracket, and casting them as a global dynamic of protest movements that were aware of each other and that were characterized by generational youth and by the bravery of that youth, the bravery and interconnectedness of that youth. And it made me realize that just as the dynamics of the way we use the words can have uncomfortable consequences and benefits for us, from a completely different perspective, the same words can be used to do very different things and take them in a very different direction. And I think I would retreat from some of the conclusions that I made about the inapplicability of the Arab Spring and Occupy to the different places. I'd now like to move on to talking about just to run through my second example of how discourses get established and the consequences this has for politics. And I'm happy that kind of what I'm doing here is attacking a straw man, because in Amr's presentation, we saw a complete absence of the thing I'm criticizing. And what I'm criticizing, and what I want to criticize, that I think Amr's presentation was a perfect example of how you can do analysis of Egypt without making this mistake, is the blanket application of the Islamic or Islamist term to complicated situations and internally differentiated groups. I mean, I've watched and I think this is very dangerous. This is an example of how discourses really can get people killed. I mean, I think of the last year, and I've watched the jokey association of pious Muslims who are also involved in politics in Egypt and Tunisia with sheep. And I've watched that, and it started off both in these in-power elites of the countries in questions and in the salons and commentary houses of Western institutions. And it got gradually more and more established, and then when, for a whole series of internal political reasons, the Sisi government decided to get rid of the sit-in at the mosque, that there's the last remnants of the Muslim Brotherhood clinging to the power they'd just lost, and large amounts of people were killed by the Egyptian military, the discourse became a genuine bloodbath. And then it was not long after that that you saw on the streets, that you saw being distributed in Tahrir Square, sheep that had been butchered. And that was the point. People were quite clear. They're sheep, you can butcher them. And we have. So if you're cheerleading for the Sisi regime after the Sisi regime has got rid of the Rabat sit-in with violence, you explain it by saying, well, we dehumanize them. We've already done the hard work of dehumanizing them and equating them with sheep. You know, Eid al-Adha is coming up. And as you can tell, this kind of easy use of political Islam to making it seem like it's a unified thing, I mean, I think it misses all the viable explanations for what's actually happened in the region, whether they be the internal politics within Islamist blocs. The Muslim Brotherhood was so scared of the Noor party taking away their key constituency that they jerked to the right in some of the negotiations, and they forgot that the military, who they thought they already had on side, weren't on side. And Nahda in Tunisia, again, so worried about the tiny Salafist minority eking away at their rhetoric that they jumped towards the Salafist side whilst forgetting that this is going to have broader implications. That caused them a great deal of problems. And of course now you've got the Sisi government having taken power on a wave of secularist rhetoric in which political Islam has been othered as sheep, now very, very quickly and explicitly using Islamic rhetoric to justify what they've been doing. So they've been distributing to the conscript army the popular Islamic preacher Amr Adly, who was the subject of many a glossy newspaper article before Mubarak fell. Videos with him telling the conscripts that by serving the Sisi regime, you're performing a task for God. And El-Sisi has completely rejected the Turkish model, which is going to be the subject of the next two presentations. He's completely rejected that Turkish model of political Islam that the Muslim Brotherhood had been completely obsessed with. Now, were the Muslim Brotherhood completely obsessed with the way the Turkish model successfully transferred from authoritarianism to democracy, or were they obsessed with the way the Turkish model enabled the AKP to become increasingly authoritarian, or were they just obsessed with the Turkish model because it enabled the AKP to become incredibly powerful and get a great deal of money? I would say probably the latter. So my conclusion, I would say that it matters a great deal what we call it.
Right. Thank you so much, Alexander. Now we turn to Dr. Ayça Alemdaroglu. Ayça is lecturer in Introductory Studies program at Stanford. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge. Her current research focuses on the ways in which young people experience social hierarchies and negotiate their place in economy, higher education, and urban space, as well as politics. Next academic quarter, Ayça will teach a course entitled From Tahrir to Taksim, Cities and Citizens in the Middle East. Tonight, her presentation is titled Youth and Politics in Turkey.
Thank you, Burçak. Thank you for organizing this timely event. Also, Bob, thanks, and inviting me here. And I want to thank you too, because you talked about youth and generational change, as well as you raised the question whether Turkey could be a model for the rest of the Middle East. Since the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011, and more recently the protests in Turkey and Egypt in the summer of 2013, some themes were deemed as causally pertinent in the uprising across the Middle East. One of the most talked about issues was young people and their role in bringing about the protests and the forms that they took. I would like to reflect on some of the ways in which the protests challenged the predominant ways in which scholars and policymakers understand or misunderstand young people in the region. A dominant perspective on youth in the Middle East is the youth bulge theory. For those who are not familiar with this term, it basically means the high proportion of young people to the rest of the population. Youth bulge is often posed as a major security threat to the West in the first quarter of the 21st century. Accordingly, as the young people grow frustrated and resentful in crowded environments with little opportunity and parental authority, they become potential actors for religious insurgency, social unrest, and war. And this framework is applied to Middle East as well as South Asia, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. So singling out Muslim youth as exceptionally risk-prone for security, in a way marshals demography into military strategy. In a way, it locates violence in numbers, and definitely feed into these alarmist images of the youth in the region, and also feeds into the enduring cultural stereotypes that we have about the region and its youth. So this framework has been prevalent in media, policy, and military circles that they portrayed the expansion of Islamism or extremism as dependent of the number and the feelings of young people in the region. So while this perspective considers marginality and lack of opportunities, it reduces Muslim youth culture to Islamism or religious extremism, and posits it as exceptional in relation to the other youth cultures around the globe. However, we know that conditions of young people in the Middle East are not that exceptional. The United Nations World Youth Report 2007 indicates that in today's world, the increasing cost of education, high unemployment, lack of decent jobs, decreasing real wages, widening social inequality inform the conditions of young people from Los Angeles to Cairo, from Moscow to Sao Paulo. So, I mean, going back to what Alexander said, it is really valid argument. It's a valid argument to think about all these movements in connection to each other, all these protests from Indignados to Occupy Wall Street to Turkey and to Egypt. So in the case of the Middle East, the protests show us that the large majority of young people who were out in the street are not that exceptional. They're out in the streets not to call for radical Islam, but call for an end to political and economic repression that has so long been their experience. In fact, the series of youth protests across the globe should take us further away, as I said, from this exceptionalist arguments about Muslim youth who faces similar economic inequalities, deals with equivalent constraints in transition to adulthood, and experience comparable injuries in their pursuit of social respectability. So coming to Turkey, for those who haven't followed the events, in summer 2013, Turkey witnessed young people going out onto the streets to defend first the trees in a small park in Istanbul, and then their freedom against the Justice and Development Party's profit-driven, socially conservative, and increasingly authoritarian rule. So it all began as a peaceful sit-in against the government's plan to build a shopping mall in Gezi Park in Istanbul's central Taksim Square. The number of protesters grew exponentially as they were met with police brutality, and they were also met with the government's marginalizing sort of discourse about them, portraying them as agents of the enemies of Turkey, both domestic and foreign. So the police attack on protesters turned a small-scale local protest into a city and countrywide uprising. Plenty of analysis has appeared in domestic and foreign media about the causes, the methods, and effects of the events. While government supporters insist on portraying protests as a product of, as I say, foreign and domestic conspiracies to weaken Turkey's successful economy and its increasing role in world politics, many analysts have emphasized the democratic nature of protests and the novelty, diversity, and the humor that the protesters displayed. To most analysts, however, young people's role in the uprising, their determination, their solidarity and politics came as a surprise. This role was unexpected because young people had been identified for so long in Turkey as apolitical and individualistic for, as I said, a long time. The uprising posed a fundamental challenge to the discourse of apathy, youth apathy. So to go back a little bit to the historical context that bring about this discourse, the dominant discourse about youth as that they are politically apathetic, we should go back to the 1980 coup d'etat and the context it created, the depolitization it created in the country. So the state, the military regime that ruled the country between 1980 and 1983 and the civilian government that followed it defined the state's ideological scope as Turkish Islamic synthesis and imposed this on society as a panacea against the impact of socialist, other left-wing and Kurdish nationalist ideologies, which were predominant among young people. So young people were inculcated with this ideology in schools through mass media and by a security regime that repressed alternative political expressions and action. So it was not only the state institutions that were agents of this systematic effort, the family also played a central role in bringing up the next generations with disinterest, fear, and disgust of politics. Parents across social classes guided their youngsters to stay away from politics and focus on their careers as students, workers, or professionals. Even parents who had actively taken part in left or right student movements in the 70s did not present politics to their children as something worth of pursuing. One needs to insert a parenthesis here about the Kurdish youth, but I'm not going to go into that. But I want to just say that they didn't have the luxury to avoid politics because of the clashes between the PKK and the Turkish state. But we can talk about it during the Q&A session. So young people protesting day in and day out in major cities, putting up barricades to guard against police attacks, coming up with humorous critiques of the government, forming discussion forums in local parks, and practicing participatory democracy at the neighborhood level compelled us to ask what happened, what did we understand wrongly about young people. And how did they become the most active agents of this uprising? So my response to these questions is the following. So it is true that there has been a widespread self-proclaimed disinterest among young people about politics in Turkey. But most of these analyses are based on survey data. Like people, as researchers, we go and we ask, are you interested in politics? And they say no. And then there's no further question. But when you go a little bit deep into what they think about politics and ask the reasons why they are not interested in politics, then they have they express a range of feelings and criticism about political practice, politicians, and procedural democracy. They also had an understanding of the historical circumstances, which I talked about, that render politics inaccessible, unworthy, and even dangerous in Turkey. So I took these feelings and criticisms as expressions of their political views. Thank you. and their views also about the issues of power and inequality in the country. So, in fact, they have been, understood as politically apathetic, identified with apathy, but in fact, the word apathy, which comes from Greek, doesn't really explain the pathos, the feelings, the feeling of suffering that these young people express when they talk about politics. So despite their self-proclaimed disinterest in politics, young people did in fact talk about politics, had ideas about political parties, and adjusted their expectations, more importantly, according to the performance of the governments. I define this as cynicism rather than apathy. And when you think of their approach to politics as cynical, what happened in summer 2013 doesn't come too much as a surprise. So we know that cynicism is not something that is peculiar to Turkey. In fact, as Jeffrey Goldfarb has diagnosed in the case of the U.S., it's a common phenomena, and it generates legitimation through disbelief. That is to say, it legitimizes the political order by allowing people to put an emotional distance between their expectations and politics. So democracy as we practice today depends largely on the existence of cynical subjects and cynical distance. So the June protests in Turkey can be seen as the closing of the cynical distance to politics in Turkey. The youth who have been criticized for being apolitical for decades are out to exhibit the rest of the country the failure and hypocrisy of the Justice and Development Party's so-called democratization. They rise against the government's authoritarian and creeping religious conservatism captured in the motto of religious youth, which Prime Minister Erdogan and his government set out to cultivate. I have further information about who was there, so what qualities that this population had other than being young people, and also their demands and also the effects of the protests, but I don't have time for that. So we can talk about it in Q&A.
Thank you, Ayça. Our fourth speaker is Kabir Tambar, who's assistant professor of anthropology at Stanford. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago and taught at the University of Vermont before joining us at Stanford. As an anthropology of the Middle East and Muslim world, he has published widely on vicissitudes of secular political identities, contemporary appropriations of and challenges to Turkish nationalism, and the politics of devotional affect in Alevi Muslim contexts. His book, The Reckoning of Pluralism, Political Voice and the Demands of History in Turkey, is coming out from the Stanford University Press this spring. Tonight, he will talk to us about popular protest and the politics of the present in Turkey.
Thank you, Burçak, and thank you all for coming and for staying here for my talk as well. So let me begin by saying that I was not in Turkey during the month of June when the protests against the government centered at Gezi Park began. I was in Turkey in July, and while protests continued throughout that month, they occurred with less frequency. The situation had, in that sense, cooled down, and much political activity had, at that point, been redirected to some of the forums that had been taking place nightly in neighborhood parks. My thoughts today are less about trying to understand the causes or consequences of the protests as a whole. My reflections remain a bit more fragmentary than that. Instead, I wish to center my discussion on two vignettes, two rather minor events that I observed while I was in Istanbul. And I'll use these vignettes then to begin to develop an account of what it means to talk about the popular character of the protest. The first vignette comes from a speech delivered by Selahattin Demirtas, the chairman of the pro-Kurdish Peace and Democracy Party. Addressing his party members in late June, Demirtas began by speaking at length about bombings that took place in Roboski village in the province of Shirnak in December 2011. Two Turkish fighter jets fired at and killed what, according to the government, were perceived to be PKK militants crossing the Turkish-Iraqi border. In the event, it turned out that the 34 individuals who were killed were in fact civilians, not guerrillas. They were smuggling goods like cigarettes, tea, and oil across the border. And it appears that security forces were in fact well aware of these circuits of trade, which have been around for a long time. Despite major protests that erupted after this incident across many Kurdish majority cities in the southeast of Turkey, the official investigation has not yet led to the prosecution of the guilty parties. So it was this set of events that Demirtas was speaking about quite passionately in June. About 10 minutes into his discussion, he indicated that this sort of state violence is not only applied to Kurds. Just look what's happening on the streets today. Quote, when looking from Gezi Park or when looking from Dikmen, Roboski is more easily understood, end quote. What's striking about the statement is that in the early days of the protests, there was a considerable amount of public chatter about whether or not Kurdish activists and ordinary citizens were expressing support for the Gezi protests. For some Gezi protesters who have seen Kurds rise up en masse to protest state violence on countless previous occasions, there was some frustration that Kurdish cities hadn't displayed the kind of fierce street politics that they had often been known for. Demirtas's speech, however, reversed the perspective, saying that Turks are now only seeing what their state is capable of, what that state has done and continues to do to its citizens, and are only now experiencing a historical reality that Kurds had long known. Similarly, a striking image began to circulate on Facebook of someone holding a sign at Taksim Square that said, "Now you understand why every Kurdish house has a double satellite dish." The sign was referencing the fact that the Turkish media had effectively functioned under a kind of informal censorship, not covering the protests and the acts of state aggression used to police the protests. Here again, the issue is that the Turkish media had not suddenly fallen quiet under the thumb of a particular authoritarian rulership, but that it had long been like this, with the only difference being that the government supporting self-censorship was now plainly visible to the Turkish majority. Okay, let me leave this set of issues to the side for a moment and move to the second vignette. This one is a bit more quotidian, perhaps even more trivial. On a balmy evening in mid-July, I was walking down Istiklal Caddesi, the main pedestrian thoroughfare in Istanbul, at once a social and commercial hub and the main site of the Gezi protests themselves. As is common enough, I encountered a group of young street musicians who happened to be playing songs by Kazım Koyuncu, a singer from the Black Sea region of Turkey. The street musicians, it turned out, were from Rize, a province along the Black Sea. At the end of one of their songs, the guitarist, who couldn't have been more than 18 years old, stepped forward and addressed the crowd of some 30 people who had gathered to listen. The guitarist said that they were from the eastern Black Sea region, that they had been following the Gezi events very closely. He continued that in their hometown, they had known for a long time about the sorts of issues that were percolating around Gezi Park. They witnessed dams built on rivers where they swam as kids, the construction of a highway along the coast that effectively cut off the local populations from the sea, the Chernobyl disaster and the deaths from irradiation through something as innocent as drinking locally produced tea, and more generally, the buying, selling, and destroying of the natural environment. They had seen the Turkish state's involvement in all of this before, he said, and they were seeing a variant of this again in the privatization of public parks, such as the plans to remake Gezi. This statement was in many respects quite different from the Kurdish instances I just described a moment ago. Here, the guitarist was not speaking about police violence. He was talking about the destruction of the natural environment. But both of these cases share a kind of argumentative logic that I find striking and wish to elaborate. Both of them suggest that the Gezi events, which were frequently presented by participants and observers alike as being so strikingly new and spontaneous, in fact belong to longer histories of state violence and destruction, histories that a privileged majoritarian viewpoint has hitherto rendered inscrutable. So let me turn away from these vignettes and speak a bit more broadly about the question of popular protest. I speak of popular protest as a question because the issue of whether or not a protest is popular is oftentimes an open question, a contested reflection on the nature of a political event as it unfolds. The ruling Justice and Development Party, or the AKP in its Turkish acronym, was highly invested in claiming that the Gezi protests were not of a popular character. Prime Minister Erdogan famously referred to the protesters as çapulcu, or as looters, basically. The label was an attempt at discrediting the political grievances raised by the protesters. It was a way of asserting that the protesters were a rather small, insignificant bunch of disgruntled youth committing hooligan-like criminal activities, rather than something that constituted a serious political movement that should be addressed as such. AKP also held counter rallies with large crowds in an effort at displaying their continued popular support. So the issue of whether a protest is popular or not is, in this sense, a question that configures the politics of the event itself. This is true, of course, not only in a protest movement, but even in elections. When a political party wins by a majority vote by the smallest margin and then goes on to declare that it has a popular mandate, that party is not simply asserting an empirical fact. The popular is not merely a matter of counting and quantifying. It's about political self-presentation. It's a claim to political authority. And of course, opponents of the ruling party in Turkey insist that its electoral majority is very slim and therefore not actually large enough to be considered properly popular. The Gezi events did indeed draw from a wide range of social groups and political identities, including, among others, nationalists and secularists, but also religious minorities, sexual minorities, politicized Muslims critical of the ruling government, and so on. But to say that this coalition of groups constituted a single protest movement does not in itself tell us that they shared a single aim. For some protesters, the problem principally was the ruling party's increasingly restrictive control on public life. For others, the issue was more about the use of extraordinary police violence to contain dissent. For others, the issue was, in fact, about a public park and the privatization of public spaces. In this sense, the popular character of protests is not simply about the heterogeneous identity of the participants, but also a heterogeneity of purpose and political interest. We do ourselves an analytical disservice if we attempt to give a single, clean answer to the question, what were these protests actually about? This is not simply a question that's posed by external commentators like foreign news correspondents or anthropologists or whoever for the sake of disseminating information. There are multiple answers to that question given by participants themselves. The multitude of responses represents a reflexive moment that's internal to the protests themselves, part of their unfolding as a political event. So it behooves us to think carefully about this reflexive activity, not only in terms of what local participants are saying their aims are, but also in terms of how they are reflecting on those events. It's here, in relation to the question of how participants themselves were reflecting on these events, that the vignettes with which I began become particularly interesting. Of course, the content of the vignettes matters, that is, the modes of state violence that they depict. But I'm also struck by the form of their arguments. There's a politics of history at work in which the Gezi protest appears significant, not only because of the challenge it raised most immediately to the ruling government, but because that event provides the occasion for articulating longer histories and deeper structures of oppression. The Gezi events are taken up by various groups for the sake of redefining the historical contours of the present. These arguments breathe a historical heterogeneity into the present. The question of the popular, then, is not only about the identity of the participants or about the various aims that they pursue in coalition, but also about a multitude of histories that are brought to bear on those events. We might want to ask why these various groups are casting historical narratives around the Gezi events. The answer, I think, is at least twofold. First, fairly early on in June, the protests moved from being about a local struggle over a park to being a national issue. Not only were supporters drawn from across Istanbul, but concurrent protests were sparked throughout many cities in Turkey, in both metropolises and in some provinces. Connecting an issue that has particularly affected the Black Sea or the Kurdish southeast into the Gezi events is also about demonstrating that those issues were never simply regional problems, that they always carried a bigger stake for the country as a whole. The privatization of public lands in the Black Sea in this rendering was always a national problem. What has long been called the Kurdish issue has always been the Turkish issue. A seemingly regional crisis is moved from the periphery to the center and shows up a crisis at the heart of the nation. Second, the Gezi events as they unfold are immediately about the present day. To tie a history of oppression in the Black Sea or a history of violence against Kurds into the Gezi protests is to suggest that those histories are not simply a black stain on the country's past, but that they persist into the present, and that the persistence of that oppression is visible here and now. A problem that for some may be relegated to the past tense as something that the country has moved beyond is foregrounded here as a defining characteristic of the present, as the limit to any possible movement forward into the future. Okay, so I wish to conclude by turning to one more vignette. Every week, a group called the Saturday Mothers hosts a public gathering to commemorate individuals who were forcibly detained by security forces, disappeared, and are now presumed dead. Many of those disappearances took place in the 1980s and 90s, and in most cases, neither the bones of the dead have been returned to their families, nor have the perpetrators been brought to justice. The Saturday Mothers started to hold these gatherings in the mid-1990s, eventually stopped holding them, and then resumed them a few years ago. So their activities long precede the Gezi events. In Istanbul, they gather on Istiklal Caddesi, the street where the Gezi protests had been most active. At these events, normally participants talk about relatives and friends who were disappeared, but this past summer, they were also talking about the individuals who had died during the Gezi events. In reference to those protesters, one participant said, quote, "The scenario hasn't changed, only the players have changed," end quote. In other words, the people in charge have changed, but the violence unto death doled out by security forces in Gezi is a pattern that the Saturday Mothers have witnessed for decades. Another participant commented on the fact that the Prime Minister recently made a speech in a Kurdish-majority province about the ongoing peace process between the Turkish state and the PKK, in which Erdogan reportedly said that, quote, "Spring had come to the mountains and mothers will no longer cry." The speaker at the Saturday Mothers event responded to these comments saying that in only 1 month, 5 young people had been killed by the police. Are their mothers not really mothers, he demanded? Here again, the Gezi events come to be articulated to a longer history of state violence. In making that articulation, these participants identify a continuity with an earlier era of state power that the ruling government often claims to have superseded and left behind. We're given a sobering reminder that the present is not easily made past in the name of political progress. And here, the disappeared figure is not a problem of Kurdish separatism or terrorism, but an instance, even a model, of a popular experience of state violence that is coming to be shared by those in the Western provinces. The popular in all of these cases does not represent a unified front against a single opponent. The issue is not only that political coalitions are often fragile, prone to infighting and falling apart, but that popular protest is constituted by pluralities that pull it in various directions. Undoubtedly, this centrifugal force is hard to translate directly into formal politics, such as parliamentary elections, where there's great pressure to unify opposition under a single name, and where the logic of quantitative majority reigns. However, it may be that the power of the popular lies not in the possibility of a substantial unity, but to the contrary in the ways it provokes a proliferation of divergent positions, purposes, and histories. The power of the popular may lie not in its ability to draw various actors into the orbit of consensus, but in its ability to disturb the given terms of consensus itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Kabir. And I think all of our panelists deserve a round of applause for their analysis. Before we start the question and answer, would you like to respond to each other's presentations? Any questions to the panel from?
There's only 20 minutes, so we can always talk among each other.
All right, then I think we have a mic circulating if you have a question. Shannon. We have a question here.
Can I speak loud? Can you hear me?
Oh, I think somebody else got
Yes.
it first.
My question is to the last panelist, to the people on your right, on Turkey. And instead of just talking about youth, I was wondering if there wasn't an overlap with middle classes and the fact that maybe this social bulge led to also other forms of economic accumulation and the values that come with it and the connectivity to the world that comes with it. Maybe we're missing something there, and I wanted your reaction on that.
Well, one of the explanations about the Gezi Park, as you pointed, is also the rise of the middle classes. As Turkey develops, middle classes sort of demand more from the state in terms of right and resources. That is a plausible argument, but that argument, in a way, misses the aftershocks of the events, where we see protests in various places, not only in middle-class neighborhoods or a touristic neighborhood like Taksim, but all around Turkey, in places where we see lower middle-class, lower-class Alevi groups are out in the streets, as well as also what Kabir was talking about, what happened before Gezi Park. So the middle class was there, that we can't deny, but there were other things going on. There are other things going on before and after the events, which make us think middle class is not the only explanation.
About 10 days ago, General El-Sisi wanted immunity from prosecution. He must be worried. Should he be worried? Secondly, the Muslim Brotherhood has been around for 85 years. They will never go away, and the army will never go away. So what is the way out of this?
I suppose this question is for me. So, well, I believe that definitely, like, Sisi has to be worried, like, no doubt about that. Well, if you get like at least like 1,500 people killed in a couple of months, like, you should be worried. Somebody has to pay some bill, like, sooner or later. So that's one thing. I was just having this discussion actually just briefly before the session. I believe that the relationship between the military and the Brotherhood, which stretches back at least to the 1950s, when this, like the current, not the current, well, like when the July 1952 military takeover happened, the relation between the two of them is much more symbiotic than we think. And I don't believe that the military has any illusions about like annihilating the Brotherhood. And I don't believe that the Brotherhood has any illusions about bringing down the state, even though this is like the discourse that they use against each other. You have this verbal violence and symbolic violence. The thing is that it won't be possible for the police state, actually, that has been governing the public sphere for the last 60 years in Egypt to come back without having the Brotherhood. You have to have them there. And it won't be possible for the Brotherhood, which is a very antiquated and outdated structure, really, to survive without having this kind of thing. So, and that's the only thing that they know, that the Brotherhood is saying that, yeah, like, we lost power. They're no longer interested in power, by the way. Not like, it's not that they know that, they even believe that there is even a flicker of a chance of like getting Morsi back. They know that it's like done for. But then they know that you cannot establish a stable political system that actually functions while excluding the Brotherhood. So they know that they will have to negotiate with the military sooner or later on the conditions according to which they will be reintegrated. And that's why they are, or they believe that they are buying time by protesting, by making things like much worse for the coup authorities, as they call them, and this will like better up their negotiating position. On the other hand, the military believes that they are the ones gaining time, by actually passing the constitutional amendments and going like ahead with redesigning the political regime till they like reach a moment, actually they push the Brotherhood to reach the moment when they have to decide whether to participate in elections or not. And of course we know that this is the only thing that the Brotherhood can do actually, which is like going through elections. So that would be the moment when they will have to negotiate. So they all know that they will, like both know that they will negotiate at a certain moment. Of course, the only problem is actually like the 1,500 people that got killed in the process. Because I have no idea how the Brotherhood leadership is going to reach an agreement in the future, just like that. And that's it. And actually this way is like, if I just like may comment, like sheep actually, yeah, I saw the poster, it's like hideous, the one with the Sisi, like butchering sheep. But actually like sheep, the moment it was like used before, like the way it was brought up when the Brotherhood were ruling, had to do with this thing of like a herd. That you have like many people that can just be rallied together and they don't really think that much. And as a matter of fact, I find it really stunning that you have the basis of the Brotherhood not questioning the leadership up to now. It's amazing. Maybe because of like the repression, possibly. But then we have to really consider that it is eventually like some form of a Sufi order, really. Like they do, it's like a very hierarchical, very patriarchal, very antiquated structure that I believe is a liability on everybody. But then, of course, this does not mean that it should go, or that it will go away.
Military and Egypt is not new. It goes at least from the founder of Muhammad Ali, the founder of modern Egypt, was a military general in the Ottoman occupying army. And before that, the French defeated the Mamalik. And Muhammad Ali then, for benefit of he got the Mamalik, the remaining Mamalik in the citadel, and just murdered them all. So further, that's on the negative side. On the positive side, it was Muhammad Ali and his military aspirations, an program of modernization and industrialization that made modern Egypt as we know it. Consider that. On a second note, the youth bulge reminds me of 1968, not just in the United States, in France, and in Egypt. I was a participant in the demonstrations of 1968 against Nasser, one of the first popular demonstrations in that era.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for your comment. I think I saw a hand up here.
Thank you for these very provocative presentations. I wanted to ask Kabir if you think, and perhaps also Ayça or any of you, that the recent developments may have had any effect on the general attitudes of Western Turks towards Kurds. I've often been pretty shocked when being in the West about attitudes among the general population towards the Kurds. And I'm also wondering if there's any investigation of any interaction or cooperation among Kurdish activists from the East and any of the activists right now in the West. And then another related question, apparently so many Kurds are coming from the East to the West because of, insecurity and poverty and lack of opportunities. And if any of them have, if you've run into any of activism and cooperation among the protest of the Kurds.
Well, I would have a hard time making any sort of clean, general sort of assessment about whether, sort of Turks in general have started to feel differently about Kurds. But I can give you another, since this is just the way I've been talking all day, another sort of small little vignette which sort of speaks to this, which is that, so as actually both of us briefly mentioned, in Turkey, after, probably by the second month of the protests, a lot of political activity was taking place in these neighborhood parks where they weren't these kind of big, large-scale sort of protests that were happening on the streets, but there was more a kind of open set of conversations, discussions about what people's concerns were, what people's sort of political critiques were. A very sort of, I think Ayça used the phrase, a kind of participatory atmosphere that had really developed in a extraordinary fashion. And I have a friend who is Kurdish, who's very actively involved in teaching Kurdish, and is involved in kind of linguistic political activism. And he lives in a neighborhood in Istanbul that has historically been fairly kind of Turkish nationalist in orientation. And he said he was surprised and it was a neighborhood where one of these neighborhood parks, one of the sort of larger forums had been happening. And he had been attending them, and he was surprised at how there was an effort by certain people to kind of try and co-opt this set of protests and make it a kind of nationalist, secularist kind of opposition to the AKP, to make the protest just about that, and to start employing some of the symbolism, the kind of images of Atatürk and the Turkish flag and so forth. And then there was a general kind of opposition to that by a lot of people in the park saying, no, that's not what this is all about. Don't make it just about that. That's too limiting, and kind of close that down and opened up a much wider discussion about, say, the Kurdish issue than at least my friend claims he'd ever heard in that neighborhood. And he ended up, like a month later, doing these kind of small impromptu Kurdish lessons in the park itself for just people who were curious and interested who lived in the neighborhood. And so he felt very optimistic that there was a real opening that was happening that he would never have predicted before. So perhaps that is a sign of some sense of broader shifting attitudes in some fashion.
We are running out of time, so what I'm going to propose is combining questions. First Ali and then you.
Thank you. It is an excellent panel. My question is to Kabir. Turkish state was always oppression, mechanisms of oppression and suppression have been there. But what is new here? What's novel, so that it somehow, pushed all kind of different groups somehow unite and form a new kind of zone of coalition, which is, I think, quite extraordinary. So in order to understand this, novelty, if you look at, the new mechanisms of oppression, what would you see?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, I think the only thing I would say is I don't know that the kind of novelty of the coalition, I don't think is strictly a function of a new form of oppression. I would say that there are a lot of conjunctural factors that have come into play. So the kinds of stuff that Alexander was talking about, so the sense that there is, protests happening all over the place in neighboring areas, Spain, Egypt, across the Middle East, the United States, across Europe, Greece, of course, even closer. So there's a kind of, I think, something that's happening globally that, suggests or I think demands a kind of deprovincialization of certain political demands. So a sense that if you're going to talk about, say, a Kurdish issue, that's important to talk about, but also then to figure out what are the ways in which this fits into a broader global moment. And in fact, it's actually, it would be I'm sure somebody has worked on this, because maybe, as I'm thinking about this, it seems like an obviously interesting thing to study. But of course, Kurdish political movements, at least since, the PKK, have always sort of inserted themselves into different kinds of global political movements, whether it was the left in an earlier moment, or it was, shifting political alliances across the Middle East in later periods. But now it seems like there is a sense that it's not a kind of, communist left or something that's going to tie you to a global political movement. There is some sense of this kind of, I don't know, something that I think the issue of youth taps into. I think a number of different things tap into, but I think there's a set of global conjunctural things that maybe make this happen. But I'm speaking just off the cuff. I'd be interested to hear more about what you think about this.
Anybody else want to respond to that, or?
Okay, mine is more like a comment than a question. I just wanted to thank Kabir for bringing up, even though it says popular protest here, I thought we were going to talk about the Gezi protest, but instead you went and talked about Roboski. I just want to say that I'm a Kurdish American, I guess, or I was born and brought up in Istanbul, and then I moved here. Sorry, this is my first time ever talking in a seminar like this, so I'm a bit nervous. So I was born there, and I lived there 14 years, and then moved here, lived another 12 years here. So over here, I felt really, and I wanted to thank Ayça for this distinct thing between cynicism versus being apolitical, and how Kurdish people don't really have the choice to be apolitical. And I just wanted to have this comment. So I've been living here really free in America, and I was always okay to tell people that I'm a Kurdish from Turkey. But this past year, I've been working with another Kurdish person who owns a restaurant in Bay Area. And because there's a lot of Turkish people coming to that restaurant, he's Kurdish, but he is not ever willing to admit or say he's Kurdish to not lose customers. So working with him in America, in Bay Area, and not being able to tell I'm Kurdish is like really upsetting. For 10 years I've been here, I was so okay being Kurdish, pro-Kurdish, and all of a sudden this, I mean, I love working there. I love the people I'm working with, but it's just upsetting that in Bay Area, you're not comfortable saying who we are. Mm-hmm. And thank you for raising that protest versus the Gezi protest, because that's really nice. Thank you.
Does the panel want to respond to this? Or one last question, if there are no responses. And one more I saw at the back.
I believe in the 60s and 70s, the Turkish army overthrew the government because they were turning Islamic. I'm wondering if the same thing is happening in Egypt, that the army, fearing an Islamic resurgence, has toppled Morsi. In the meantime, last year I was in Istanbul. I was amazed that the female valedictorian was not allowed to speak because she had a headscarf. The next day, the principal was suspended. So here it is, the secularist versus the Islamist, and the same in Egypt.
I can just comment briefly on that. I think these protests show us that we should go beyond these secularist Islamist distinctions. I mean, that's I think one of the effects that people start to think about beyond those, because we had Islamists in the park as well as secularists, and then people saying, that also we should sort of pass these binaries. So, yeah.
And one last question.
Hi, so my question also pertains to Turkey, but I guess we can also extend this to the case of Egypt. So especially among the youth, almost everyone has an idea, and people disagree on it, but they have a conception of sort of someone or a group that could be blamed for what has been happening, and almost no one is really content on what's going on. So there's a very solid nature of bridges between groups that have othered each other over time. So I wonder, what does it mean for you to, see Turkey successfully doing some bridging groups that have identified themselves as something that is
So what's the next step?
I would just point out in the context, a couple of people have brought up the 60s, and it was at the very end of the 1960s in America at Kent State that the National Guard went in and killed students, American white students in some numbers. America seems to have got over it. Stanford doesn't seem to be racked by that, and whether that's just a process of forgetting, or whether it's a process of memorializing, or whether it's a generational process, I'm not quite sure.
I mean, we have been seeing all kinds of like bridging activities and thinking going on in the country now. I mean, we have seen this like huge LGBTQ march in Istanbul. I mean, in the last 10 years, we haven't seen that many people out there for LGBTQ people. So that is one, sort of effect of the events, and also like in terms of the coming together, closer together, the Kurdish and the Turkish parts. I think the effect of these events will maybe not that obvious at this point, but there are these bridges being built that we increasingly see in the society.
I'm afraid we ran out of time, so I would like to thank all our panelists for their analysis and for you to come here to attend this session. And I'm sure we can continue the conversation afterwards.